Often fantasy is a pathway into our deepest vulnerabilities and desires, but they're presented in such an imaginary or coded or a new way that we have to see them a little differently.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Let's be honest, sexual fantasy is a weird part of being human. The weirdness of our sexuality makes it hard to share it with others, even our own spouse, with whom we have no problem sharing other weird things such as a toilet or silly TV shows or, let's be honest, even farts. But I've been fascinated how couples navigate the topic of sharing sexual fantasies. Some couples, frankly, do this better than others. So I look forward to sharing some principles that I've learned along the way with you. And I'm joined by Amy Langford, who is my colleague in the coaching program. Hello, Amy.
Hello. Nice to be here with you, Dan.
Amy is a frequent guest on Get Your Marriage On, and I'm so grateful that she's back here. She is a very, very gifted couples coach. She helps couples overcome intimacy struggles in their marriage, and fantasy is one of her areas of expertise. So, Amy, I'm honored that you're here, and we get to have this fun and rather juicy conversation today.
Thank you, Dan. I'm actually excited to have this because there was a version of me not so many years ago that this topic would have completely shut me down and I literally had no bearings or identity in.
Wow, that's great. So, you're like a living testament of the growth, the sexual development and growth that we're capable of and can grow into. And I think that's why I
Absolutely.
love talking to you so much, Amy, is you're really sincere. And it's not like you're just head knowledge. It's like you walk the walk. You know it. You've experienced it. And that's what makes you such an effective and compassionate coach.
Thank you, Dan.
And today we get to talk about fantasies. Amy, before we get
Woo-hoo!
any further, can you tell me what is a fantasy? Let's define it.
Yes, absolutely. And I love this definition. It's based on what Esther Perel teaches. And she teaches that fantasy is any mental activity that generates desire and intensifies enthusiasm.
I
And so
like
if you
that.
think about, I like it too, all the
Uh-huh.
different ways this can happen, right? Whether it's sights, sounds, smells, touches, memories, meanings, times of day, words, all the different contexts, play, freedom, anything that intensifies desire and enthusiasm.
That's good. I remember reading in Barry McCarthy's book. He's a popular sex researcher and therapist.
Mm. Mhm.
In the research, we're really aroused by only one of three ways or a combination of three ways, but they really fall into one of three categories. First is physical stimulation. That makes sense,
Mhm.
right? Touch this
Mhm.
part and then we kind of become aroused. The second
Right.
is relationship oriented. This is where I feel loved by you. I feel chosen. I feel very grateful for you. And those
Mhm.
relationship meanings evoke some arousal. And the
Mhm.
third is psychological arousal, and that's this
Yes.
fantasy component. And
Yes.
it's not that one is any better or worse than others. It's not that
Mm-mm.
one is holier than others.
Nope.
And in practice,
There's no hierarchy here.
no. And in practice, we use all three or maybe a blend of the
Yes.
three. But today, for this episode, we're going to focus on category three,
Mhm.
fantasies, which can be kind of
Fantasies.
scary for some people, I guess. In fact,
Yes, because what makes fantasy so amazing is it allows us to take familiar things and create mystery around them, or take ordinary things and have them become extraordinary, or to take a very familiar partner and find new ways to interact with them. And so it's such an open, imaginative, creative new space that people sometimes are a little bit alarmed by what their imagination conjures up.
I like that because you're waking up to the next person every morning for years. But in
Yes.
fantasy, it could be a new person. Like it's
Mhm.
seeing your same spouse through fresh eyes. And that could add this, like, infuse the marriage with this newness, this novelty that it craves.
And that's really what fantasy is a lot about. It presents a problem and a solution, right? We
Hmm.
like newness, eroticism and arousal and desire like new ways of engaging. They like freedom. They like to have, openness. And so fantasy presents a way to be with the same person for years and years and years and years and years and enjoy them in an abundance of beautiful ways.
I like that. I like how you said about the freedom. Can we double click on that for a little bit? Can we zoom in a little more on freedom?
Sure, go for it.
There's an aspect of sexuality that really thrives on freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, and it's a horrible joke, but I've seen T-shirts and other things like that say that too. It's like, now that you're married, they equate it to prison almost.
Yes.
Like, as in, there's no more freedom now that you're married.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And some people view it that way. It's a very cynical approach, I think, to
Mm.
marriage. But then again, there's a little bit of truth to this because you're basically committing to monogamy. You're committing to oneness, closeness, at the
Mm-hmm.
exclusion of everything else. Yet,
Mm-hmm.
our sexuality thrives on freedom. So, how do you reconcile those two?
So you have the familiarity of the person you love and that has been chosen, and you have the trust that's been established there.
Uh
And
huh.
then you allow the fantasy to create the extraordinary out of the ordinary because there's no limits to our imagination. There's no limits to our creative capacity and the ability to create desire and enthusiasm. Our minds can be intensely creative. And so
Yes.
you can have what's familiar and trust that person. And you can also go anywhere with them in fantasy as long as there's consent.
Right. Yeah, we're doing this all above board for sure. But
Yes, yes.
so I'm wondering, Amy, what are some common themes that fantasies fall into, or maybe categories? And these can
Mm,
be, people are drawn to certain storylines in movies or stories for a
mm-hmm,
particular reason because they resonate
mm-hmm,
with
mm-hmm.
our eroticism. What are some of those common themes?
A lot of the themes are really kind of polarizing, meaning you like the surrender and the captive, you like the experienced and the
Uh
inexperienced, you
huh.
like the forbidden or the taboo, like we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't be doing this, or I don't know you, or this like the one night stand type idea, or what if someone finds us? A
Hmm.
lot of those types of themes are really popular. Another theme that's really popular is to be the center of attention, almost like
Yes.
worshipped. And I don't mean that in a sacrilegious way,
Uh huh. Uh huh.
but you have all of the gaze and the attention and focus on you. And this is often the person who, in their daily life, wants none of that. And that's part of where fantasies um, allow us to expand because in our day to day life, you may be someone who wants nothing to do with a spotlight or attention or being known. But in the bedroom with the fantasy, you can take on this whole other persona. Same with someone who really likes to be in control and have a plan and, always be on top of things. In
Right.
fantasy, in the bedroom, they may completely switch and want to be in a complete position of surrender and overtaken or something like that. And it allows us to explore all of these sides of ourselves, and some that even sometimes collide with how we like to view ourselves in our daily life.
I wonder if some people think if fantasies are good or bad. And I like to take the stance that they're not inherently good or bad, they're neutral, but it's what
Mm-hmm.
you do with them. In other words, do you let your fantasy control you and it's consuming, or are you in charge? Are you in control of your fantasy? So I think it is maybe dangerous when we overly obsess about a fantasy or it takes on too much power or control in our life and it runs our
Mm-hmm.
life. That's not a healthy
Mm-hmm.
way to live. But
Right.
also, the opposite end of the pendulum swing is where we squash every fantasy because we can't tolerate it. We can't even,
It's too
uh,
distressing.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a healthy way to live either. There's some sweet spot in the middle where we allow fantasy because we use it to build us. And so we're the
Mm-hmm.
chooser, we're the arbiter
Yes. And
of
I
that.
think that's the important part, understanding that you're the chooser. You ultimately do have control over your imagination and what parts you choose to embrace and develop. And you also do this in context with your spouse, right? Like this isn't just a solo activity. And some of
Right,
the
right.
things that are very enticing and increase enthusiasm for you may not for them. And so you're like, well, That's fine as a fantasy, but in the context of this relationship, it's not going to produce much fruit. So it's not that it's bad or shameful, but let's find more collaborative space. And so I think what could be good or bad with fantasy is if it's used to control or shame or used as some type of manipulation or in a way that doesn't respect both partners.
That's true. You can also use fantasy that will create more distance or as a way to escape the marriage.
Mm. Mm.
Some people could be fantasizing about someone else, maybe specifically, or just something that basically is a way to escape from the demands that the relationship offers and or requires. And that's probably a misuse of fantasy if your goal is to stay married long term, that is.
Right. I do see sometimes the fantasy becomes more important than the spouse, than the person
Yes,
who's live and with them. And again, while there's nothing wrong, most, for the most part with fantasies, if having to have that fantasy becomes more important than loving the person that's actually next to you, obviously that's problematic.
right. There's also a category of fantasies that just should live in the fantasy world alone, nothing to be enacted in real life. And there are some fantasies that are fantasies. As humans, we want what we can't have.
Mm-hmm.
If you have it, then you don't need it or want it anymore. So there's going to be a large category of fantasies that might fall into the area of these are things I don't have or can't have because of the situation I'm in or the person I'm married to or because of some agreements or commitments or vows that I've made. But in the
Mm-hmm.
fantasy world, it allows you to kind of have things because we always want what we can't have.
It also allows you to have freedom of choice, right? Remember,
Right.
most fantasies you don't actually want them in reality. That's what's so different about a fantasy. They really do stay in your imagination and they're used in your imagination to create the mystery, the desire to transcend a reality maybe that you live in now. Not that there's anything wrong with that reality. This is not a lack of, this is just adding that life and energy. And so that's why a lot of times the forbidden and taboo is so enticing in reality because it indicates that capacity to choose. But if you actually could choose that in real life, you wouldn't.
Right. Right. Oh, well, this is going to be a good episode as we get into questions in just a moment. And these are questions that our readers have and listeners, podcast listeners, have sent in. I look forward to digging into those with you. And you just get the sense that the sharing a fantasy with a spouse can feel very intimate, right?
I think it's actually one of our most intimate places because you
Yes.
can't hide, right? Like a fantasy exposes the most vulnerable parts of you and parts sometimes we don't even understand, but
Yeah.
parts you want to play or themes or context or meanings or stories or, so many, our minds do get revealed in fantasy.
You might be completely comfortable naked with your spouse, like physically
Yes.
undressed, but letting
Mm-hmm.
you into my mind and what I think about, oh,
Into
like,
your erotic mind. Yep.
yeah. Well,
Yep.
that's what way more
That's
intimate
a
sometimes.
whole nother
Uh-huh.
ballgame.
I got an email from someone that asked, "Is it okay for Christians to maybe say some swear words while they're making love to each other?" I'm not gonna make a judgment. I'm not gonna answer that directly, but it does remind me how when we step into this fantasy space with our spouse, it's almost like an altered state of mind. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
uh, who we are, in the light of day, dressed up outside the bedroom is one way, but we get to experience each other it's like a new dimension, this new place when we're highly aroused in another area
Mm-hmm.
that can take on different rules, different meanings, because it's like, it was Esther Perel, who said,
Mm-hmm.
sex isn't really so much of a thing you do, but it's a place you go.
You
And
should
I love that
go.
concept. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We're stepping into a place where we can set kind of different rules, things that kind of excite us, things that
Mm-hmm.
we may never say certain words outside of this very context. But in this context, they become fuel. They become very arousing in that
Yes.
moment.
Yes. Just like when you read a fantasy novel, right? Like it
Uh huh.
takes you to a different world, a different place, a different cast of characters. And by reading it, it doesn't mean that you actually want to go to that world. But
No.
are you enjoying themes and stories and plot lines and tension that's created by this unique place and unique world and unique dynamics. Yeah. And that's what we can do with our minds, right?
Yes, and with our spouse, and that sounds really
And
exciting.
yes, and it's a great place to be able to play with the person you love and
Mhm.
care about the most.
Great. So the format today is gonna be a little different than our standard episodes. This is Q&A. We've invited our listeners to send us questions, and we've got lots of questions. Many of them are so good, we're not gonna go through them all, but
Mhm.
these questions have been, some of these are really vulnerable questions. We'll keep the person that asked the question anonymous. I'll read the question, and we'll have a conversation about each one, and then we'll get through those. How does that sound?
Sounds fabulous.
Great. So let's jump right in. Our first question has to do with a fear of having sexual fantasies, fearing our own sexual fantasies. This is what a husband wrote in to say. He said, I'm ashamed of my sexual past and fantasies. There are things I have never told a soul about, and things about my sexual desires and fantasies that I am ashamed of. If someone, especially my wife, were to know that I thought or experienced certain things, I don't think she could ever love me again. I have trouble even loving myself when I think of these things too. Yet, on the other hand, these sexual desires seem so real to me, thinking about them arouses me. So I'm ashamed that I am aroused by these thoughts or fantasies. As a result, I tend to clamp down my sexual thoughts and stay far away from anything related to these ideas out of fear that it might arouse me. I work hard to keep up a persona that I am above all of this, but sometimes I just feel depressed and exhausted when I succumb. What am I to do?
I have a lot of compassion for this gentleman. I feel like I have coached so many clients in this same space. And
Uh
so,
huh.
first, I just want to extend compassion towards him because it is a conflict that many people experience around fantasy.
Yes.
And it is representing that tension between this is what I would do in my daily life, and this is where my mind psychologically goes to find that erotic tension of arousal.
Right. Right. And kind of fearing our sexual fantasies or like, really, I'm turned on by that idea.
Mhm.
That's not uncommon.
Not at all.
That's a normal part of being human. It's kinda weird.
There are a lot of themes or context or situations and circumstances in fantasy that you have to realize are different than what you would actually want or choose in your daily life, or some people would say in the light of day or outside of your bedroom. And that's because they're inherently representing play
Uh-huh.
or the ability to move into a different space where there's more contrast, where there's different meanings, where there's different themes. And the contrast of those actually create the erotic tension and arousal. And it's very normal for people to question, like, is that really me? Like, how do I navigate the difference between who I am, like, say, in my day to day life and what comes to my mind in sexual fantasy?
Can you give me an example, maybe from a woman's perspective of what this might look like?
Yes, I can give you a lot of examples.
Okay.
So, so from a woman's perspective, I was coaching a woman once, and her husband had been through some difficult challenges in their marriage.
Mhm.
One of them being that there was a period of time where he was involved with prostitutes.
Uh-huh.
Obviously, very painful and hurtful, and they had healed from that and had worked through it. But she was very confused by the idea in their bedroom that the idea of being a prostitute was so arousing to her.
Right.
The
Uh-huh.
conflict in that, like, why would I want that when it was something that was so hurtful to me?
Right.
Or why what would be desirable in that? Like, I don't want to be an object. I don't want to be used. I don't want my husband to use me. Why would I find this particular fantasy so arousing? And
Uh-huh.
that can be the conflict that comes up. But one of the things I want to say is what fantasy can often do is present a problem and a solution.
Alright. Like, what's the problem and the solution in that situation?
So the problem is obviously feeling unchosen or feeling threatened by prostitution. And in a fantasy, you create a setting and a scene where the threat is neutralized or where the problem is no longer problematic. In fact, it's not problematic, it's arousing,
Uh-huh.
right? Like
Uh-huh.
it brings pleasure instead of pain.
Uh-huh.
And I over and over, I find this with different men and women in different settings, which I think we'll talk about later. So I won't spill all the beans on that. But
Uh-huh.
that often fantasy is a pathway into our deepest vulnerabilities and desires, but they're presented in such an imaginary or coded or a new way that we have to see them a little differently.
I see. All right. Gotcha. There's also things called, the technical term is paraphilias. These are like in the bell curve of human experience. These are things on the fringes of what you would say is sexually arousing. You know, in the bell curve, in the middle, just the things that are, we would say, very common that people
Mm,
would say, yes, that's sexually arousing. But then people experience things that are kind of a few standards of deviation away from the center.
mm-hmm.
And we're ashamed by that because it doesn't fit what the normal is. Some
Yeah.
people use a kind word like kink to
Yeah.
describe these things,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it'd be understandable if someone who has some of these these paraphilias
Mm-hmm.
to feel ashamed of that because they don't
Mm-hmm.
fit in the norm. And how they came to be, what happened, whether it's something from childhood or just something, your just normal proclivity towards certain things, that's
Mm-hmm.
hard to understand, I think. But just like maybe a little bit more self acceptance in this case.
Right.
Yeah, I do get turned on by this idea
Mm-hmm.
and just let it be neutral. I like that.
Mm-hmm. Let it be more neutral, or sometimes even just allow that in the sexual and the fantasy world, the fantasies that may come to your mind aren't anything that you would actually desire. And this
Yeah.
is the imagination playing with different contexts and themes and meanings. And that can sometimes open things up. We have a lot to talk about in fantasy, but there are so many fantasies that I hear from people that they find troublesome until they understand more of their meaning. They worry that they are somehow immoral or sinful
Or
and
deviant, and they
or
don't want to be
deviant.
seen that way. Right.
Right. And that's
So
why
they
they're
stuff and
so
hide that
yeah,
aspect of
it's
them.
such a vulnerable place to share with your spouse because you do fear their rejection or their judgment. And
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I do get emails often from listeners that will say things like, I have this, just one example might be, I really have this like fantasy of my wife. Excuse me for using this language, but this is the language that I'm thinking of that they'd write. Like, this is a husband saying, I really have this fantasy of my wife sucking me off and then kissing me and putting that semen back in my mouth. Is that
Mhm.
gross? Like, they're emailing me. I think part of it is like, I have this fantasy. I don't know if it's good or bad. Like they want to assign a moral judgment to
Yes.
this, and they're trying to reach out to someone else. They trust me.
Tell me this
I'm
is right. Tell
grateful
me
that they
this is
trust me.
wrong. Yeah.
Right. Is this, what does this tell me about me? Am I weird for this? Is this something like that? And
Hmm.
I'm not going to say to that man, yeah, you're weird. Like, what? You're crazy to think that because that's not the case. That's not real. But also, I think there's a little bit of a shame of having certain fantasies and, like, because maybe they're okay emailing a stranger like me about it, but telling his wife? Oh, like, heck no, that's really difficult to do. And so
Hmm.
you're probably looking for some support in asking if this is okay or not okay.
And even thinking of a problem and a solution, often fantasy lives close to the line of disgust.
Yes, it does.
And you're
Why is that?
playing, they're close to each other in the brain. And so,
Right.
in the state of arousal, something that may normally you may find disgusting when you're not in that context of
Uh-huh.
arousal, may actually be very arousing.
Yes, I've experienced that a lot in my own fantasies. Yeah.
Yes. And so just knowing that the arousal can change a disgust response. And even after coming out of arousal, you may be like, why did I want that? But
Uh-huh.
again, that's the erotic tension of the fantasy.
Got it.
So that
Great.
something that would be disgusting is now no longer, right? That there's freedom in there. There's no disgust, that that in the when you shared, often men share that they want to feel fully accepted. And this is
Hmm.
what that could look like, right? They've created a fantasy of what full acceptance, take the most disgusting, weird part of you, and yet put it in a storyline or a context that equals full acceptance.
Yes.
That's what a fantasy like that might be about. I
Right.
desire to be fully known and fully accepted, that even something that in your unaroused state you may find disgusting is actually wholeheartedly received.
I love what you just said. I had Dr. Steven Snyder on my podcast, and he talked about this idea that when it comes to sex, it's his belief that we all are trying to get back to what it was like. He used the idea as the infant
Mhm.
on our mother's breast, just fully loved every little wrinkle, every little, fat roll,
And not only
and
loved, but fed, nourished, cared
yes,
for, accepted, attuned to, like, every cry was answered, every
yes.
need. Yeah.
We kinda wanna get back to that, and sex as an adult is, like, for, many of us, is a pathway towards that, or what we seek. May not have the words for that, but that's,
Mhm.
like, the feeling, the emotion
Yeah.
that we're after, and I can see how what you just said about this specific fantasy about taking the most disgusting thing I can think of, part of me, but making it neutral or even accepted or celebrated
Or making it a
is
point
this.
of pleasure, right? Disgust and pleasure. You've taken it
Yeah.
from disgust to pleasure.
Right. It's that going back to this original thing that we're seeking for, that wholeness, that union
Mhm.
with ourselves and where everything's okay.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah. And I think one of the difficult parts about fantasy is often we are so uncomfortable in our own fantasies that when you bring him to a spouse, you want them to accept him in order for you to accept them.
Yeah, talk more on that. That's so true. Uh-huh.
Because you are bringing this very exposed, vulnerable, weird, unexplainable sometimes side.
Mhm.
And it appears as if your spouse says, "Wow, that's amazing. I would love that." Then that's the highest level of acceptance. And what I often have to encourage clients is it's got to come from you
You have
because
to accept yourself first.
you
We
have to
can't
accept
rely on our
yourself.
spouse to accept you
Yeah.
or every little part of you.
Right. And that this fantasy represents acceptance and it doesn't actually have to be acted out in that way.
Mhm.
Most fantasies are never, some are, there's a wide spectrum of fantasies. We probably should start there, but there is a wide spectrum of what fantasy is. And there are a lot of fantasies that don't have to be acted out in this scripted way, but just that context and meaning of full acceptance. That's what's actually being sought.
Yeah, I like that. Can we talk about we're alluding to it a little bit more. I just wanna dive just a little bit deeper before we move on. This
Yeah.
idea of wanting our spouse to validate our sexual fantasies all the time.
Mhm.
And usually I see this with the higher desire spouse, the person who thinks more novelty is better for the marriage. They're the
Mhm.
ones more creative ideas for what to do in the bedroom. And they're with a
Mhm.
spouse that doesn't agree at the same
Mhm.
level, at least, with all of their creative ideas.
Mhm.
But they expect their spouse to, go along with it all the time. And then what are some of the problems that happen when you set up the marriage in that way?
There are a lot of problems. Let me see if I can remember all of them. One of the first ones being is often the more spontaneous or the spouse with the fantasy is viewing themselves as better than or more developed in their sexuality
Yes.
when their fantasies can actually be suggesting the exact opposite. They can
Uh-huh.
actually be about seeking that validation and about their own insecurities. And so what their fantasies might actually be exposing is their sexual insecurity, and they just happen to have a lot of it.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
having or not having fantasies isn't a sign of sexual development.
Mhm. Right.
And, and so that's one of the first places we start. And the fact that so often the spontaneous or one with more fantasies is labeling this particular style as a fantasy.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
fantasies can range anything from feeling cared for, cherished, adored, chosen to scenes and ideas and role plays and, like you said, specific
Acts,
context,
behaviors.
acts, and
Hmm.
behaviors. There is a broad range of fantasy. Some people just want to feel fully teased or fully
Dominated.
spoiled, and some
Uh-huh.
want to be dominated, right? Like there's such a broad spectrum that if you are assuming a fantasy has to look like a script, then you might also be missing out on your partner's or your spouse's desire type of fantasy.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, that's good. That's good. All right. Next question.
Okay.
This comes from a husband that says his wife does not have any fantasies. He says, I'm a published author, so writing creatively comes easy to me. I've written a number of erotic stories for my wife and I, starring us, which she always enjoys. But basically, all of it stems from my own sexuality. And when I try to get ideas or input from her, she quickly shuts down and says, I have no fantasies. I know that's not true, but clearly there's something there that is a block for her. We've been married nearly 28 years, so I have a good grasp on a lot of the known of my wife's sexuality, and I'm able to write her in a way that resonates with her. But what I don't have is a good grasp on her unknown. So I think he's saying, I want to get to know the more hidden parts of her so I can
Mm.
write those into my fantasies. Which leads me to this. We have a great and very regular sex life generally, but my wife definitely falls into the category of being content with what we have and seems to be fine with doing the same things all the time. That's a little harder for me, as I'm the creative, entrepreneurial one, so it seems like I'm the one forever pushing for some variety there. What are your thoughts, Amy, about this question?
First, I have a lot of empathy for her because I literally didn't have any fantasies. And I want to speak to anyone who doesn't have that experience with fantasy. There can be a lot of reasons for that. One can be a marriage that is set up in a duty or servicing frame. And in that framework, sexual activity is work.
Yes.
And when sex is work, there isn't room for the play of fantasy, the imagination, the creativity, the other context, the meanings. And so it may not be her fault.
Mm-hmm.
She, she may not yet be in a free enough space to have fantasies. If there is any of that type of duty work, it's my job to, you know, solve your arousal type framing. That's one
Mm-hmm.
of the first things that blocks it. Um, a second might be that, again, she has a different type of fantasy. And in their marriage, fantasy is
Mm-hmm.
defined as having a creatively written script
Yes.
because that is how he has found his way to fantasy. And
Uh-huh.
hers might be more of a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
It might be more of, I want to feel cherished. I want to feel worshiped. I want to feel desired. I want to hear your explicitly erotic stories. And that is actually my fantasy. I want to be the one where all of your attention goes. So
Uh-huh.
it can look so different that what may be her fantasy is actually being dismissed.
Yes. Yes.
Or it may be that she is actually participating and giving him these clues, and he's just like, there must be something more. And that,
And just fishing for something in where there is nothing, right?
yeah, like that is the fantasy. Like, why does there have to be more?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
So, my advice to both of them would
Uh-huh.
be to take what's already working. I
Uh-huh.
love that they have these stories and maybe actually be talking about the context or themes in those and develop those between them more like in a collaborative way instead of him just writing them out.
That would be good. And it could just be that it's undeveloped, right? Or underdeveloped for her. Just taking that argument for a moment. Because
Mm-hmm.
like what you said, I mean, it takes effort and time and practice to cultivate the skill of articulating a sexual fantasy. Obviously, it's a skill that comes very easily and naturally to him. I don't think he should assume it comes naturally and easily for her. But if she wants to get to that point, then I think a little more patience, a little more room would be fine there.
I also think this is sometimes about timing. Let me
Yeah.
explain more. Because a lot of women are responsive desire. So a
Yes.
responsive desire woman is not going to be in sexual desire until she's in a arousing context for a while, right?
Yes.
And so if you ask this question outside of the actual moment where sexual desire has now been present, you've been aroused for a while, and the sexual desire has come on board, you ask it outside of that context, they may not actually have access to it.
Good point.
So sometimes it is a timing thing too. Like, wait until the whole engine's warmed up and all of those places in the body and mind are firing, and then explore.
That'd be good. I also am latching on to the end part of his questions. He says in his question, it's it's a little harder for him to accept that his wife doesn't have fantasies because he's the more creative entrepreneurial one. And it seems like, he says, it seems like I'm the one forever pushing for some variety there. And it just makes me wonder if you're the one pushing for the variety in the marriage, there's probably a little bit of danger in the relationship when you have the mentality that you've got it all put together, you're the creative one, you're the one with, the gift for writing, and now you've asked your spouse for her ideas. Like, how is she gonna compete with you on that? It's not it doesn't feel like a welcome and safe place for her to step in and to fully share, especially if her ideas of a fantasy don't live up to his expectations of what he's hoping to hear from her. So it kind of makes the marriage kind of break into a hierarchy, right? He's the
Mm-hmm.
superior one. He's the one that's got it figured out. He's the one that's pushing for variety. She's the one that's okay with the same thing over and over as if there's something wrong with that. And so no matter how hard she tries, he's always gonna be a step ahead, and that's not a fun meaning to step into. It's not a free feeling to step
Mm-mm.
into in the marriage.
It's not very sexy or inviting or collaborative.
Definitely. No, no. So I think this couple can work together better, perhaps. Of course, I'm reading into a lot of these things just on the paragraphs they wrote, but perhaps if they could work together on over time, practicing where any fantasy she has, regardless if it is on the same spectrum as his, right, is just as fine and acceptable in their marriage and equally valid as his own. I think it'll give her a little more confidence to express whatever fantasies she might have, even if they're on a very different axis on the graph, metaphorically speaking, than his.
Mhm. I do think it is sometimes more difficult for responsive women or just for women in general to feel the permission to have fantasies
Okay, yeah.
because good women aren't highly sexual.
Or so we're told,
Or
right.
so we're
Uh-huh.
told. I'm not
Yes.
making that as a statement of truth,
Yeah,
but
yep.
that
Uh-huh.
is a messaging. You can be a good wife, you can be a good mom, you can serve on all of the school committees and volunteer for everything. And no one really portrays a strong woman who's okay in herself, who's devoted to her marriage and her children, as also being highly sexual and
Mhm.
having that permission to want or to desire or to have fantasies. And so just the lack of even role models or discussions or portrayals of this can be challenging for women to recognize my sexuality is an integral part of me. I have an imagination, I have a mind, I have desires. What are those leading me to in this realm?
That's good. That's good. Love that. And you're a good role model, Amy, for all this. So everyone, look to Amy if you need a role model. Good. Great, great. And you weren't always that way, which makes your
No, not
story
at
sounds
all.
great.
Not
And for those of
at
you that don't know
all.
Amy very well, go back and listen to episode, I think it's 101. You were you've been a guest on my podcast many times, but this is
Yes.
uh, your story. It's a very inspiring story.
I share it with many people, so it's not that there's anything special about me, there isn't. I think it's just recognizing what's available to you as a woman that I didn't recognize was available and being able to have that offered and shared with me, then I want to share that and offer it to others. You can be
Great.
a very, very moral, virtuous woman and have sexual fantasies.
All right. The next question I think is a fantastic question. A lot of people have this one. It's talking about fantasies with your spouse, which is really hard to do. We can talk about why that's hard to do in a moment. But this person is asking, do you have any tricks or tips for us, a way to ease into talking about fantasies if we're not used to doing it? This is what he says. I have wondered about sexual fantasies and what might be an easy on ramp for couples who would like to explore this, but in a way that is safe for both spouses. So, what framework or boundaries would be worth putting into place, and what sort of things might it be good to discuss before diving into this?
Great question. First, I want to say I don't know if there is an easy on ramp.
I'm glad you said that. Uh huh. Uh huh.
So let's just state that I think this is just generally uncomfortable and very exposing and kind of anxiety inducing. It is parts of us that, again, we don't show to anyone, hopefully, except our spouse. And we don't talk about in the general population or in general discussions. And there's good reasons for that. And so it is going to be probably awkward.
Yes.
And I think just acknowledging that and knowing that that doesn't mean it's gone wrong, or you might feel wildly uncomfortable opening up the topic. That makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense.
Hmm. And I think there's this inverse correlation of intimacy and anxiety. And what I mean by that is the more intimate things become, the more your anxiety spikes,
Mhm.
right? If you keep your marriage at kind of arm's length, you're
Surface
going to have,
level,
yeah, low intimacy,
very
low
peaceful.
anxiety.
Yes. Yes. Not high revealing or high exposure,
Right.
then that limits the anxiety.
Right,
Um,
right. And anxiety, I don't mean like clinical anxiety per se, but it's just a general discomfort of being that close to someone.
mhm.
And I think the couples that do it really well, it's not that they've learned how to not be anxious, they just learn how to handle their anxiety better. They're more capable of tolerating that higher level of anxiety and staying in it longer. It's like
Yeah.
stepping into the fire and not getting burned, but you're going to stay in it just a little longer, kind of a feel.
And I think what makes this conversation more possible is first, if the other parts of your relationship are well established, meaning there is
Yes.
good trust, there is good confidentiality, there's good
Hmm.
partnership, there is a
Friendship.
capacity, there's good
Yes.
friendship and companionship, and that there's already an established intimacy that is preferred by both. Meaning that if you are in like a duty framework or a servicing framework, or you're having fights over intimacy all the time, it's
Uh huh.
probably not a good time to bring up a fantasy. You've got some other things to work out
Right.
first. If you are working through betrayal or some other, deeply troubling relational thing, it's probably not the time to bring up fantasies. So, and I think the other thing is, if, let's say, you do have good intimacy in general, you have a good partnership, you have a good relationship, there's high amounts of trust already, then if you're going to enter into this conversation, it has to be in the framing of, this is not a to-do list or an
Right.
expectation that I'm bringing to you that now you have to produce.
It's an exploration. That's
Yes.
what it is. Yeah. Yeah, because if there's any edge of, okay, now that I said I have this fantasy, you have to do it, whether or not it was intended that way, but
Mhm.
the receiver of that fantasy might just by upbringing think, oh, I need to do everything he or she wants to make him or her happy. It's not going to be helpful either. So just understand this is neutral. This is just an exploration.
An exploration, and I think even having the freedom to understand some of the meanings of fantasy.
Yeah.
Again, wanting to be seen, wanting to be known, having an imaginative context that allows you to explore your deepest vulnerabilities. This is
Yeah.
what fantasies often represent. And so if you have that context first, then you can explore the meanings of those. And it doesn't have to be this specific act or this specific position or this specific role play. You can have a lot more collaboration in those meanings.
I love it. That's great. Which leads us to the next question, which is related. This person says, my spouse disrespects me when I share a fantasy. This person writes, how do you go about either feeling awkward telling your partner your fantasy or telling them that you're wanting to completely changing it or turning it, saying you only want that because, for example, you just want other guys to hit on you, or feeling awkward in what they say is theirs, even though they're trying to only not fail or not do it to their expectations. I don't know if that was really clear, but I
Yeah,
think
that
the
was a
idea
little,
is what do you do when you share a fantasy and it's not received the way you want to?
or I think the meaning is misinterpreted.
Yeah.
And I think that's the helpful part of understanding yourself first. Let's
Yes.
let's imagine this person is sharing. It sounds like maybe let's make her female. I don't actually
Okay.
know if this is male or female, but let's make this a female. And she has a fantasy of being hit on by
By other
another
men.
man
Uh-huh.
in front of her spouse. And if you are believing that fantasies represent what you want in reality, that would
Uh-huh.
be a very threatening thing to share.
Right.
If you are understanding that fantasies often represent a deeper vulnerability, a threat
Mhm.
that gets neutralized, like jealousy, wanting to be, a lot of women fantasize about being captive or controlled or overtaken. There
Yes.
is nothing about that fantasy that they want in real life,
Right.
right? Right? There's nothing that a lot of couples want about their fantasies when they actually share them with me. What they represent is a vulnerability. And so it may be to her that having another man hit on her is one of the biggest threats to her, that she feels that would jeopardize their relationship the most.
Yes.
And she has then created a fantasy around that because in fantasies, you're always safe.
You're
Threats
always
are
in control.
neutralized. You're always in control. No one's
Yep.
ever harmed.
Mhm.
And pain becomes pleasure, or fear becomes, arousing. And so
Yes.
you take some area where you feel extremely vulnerable. Or maybe it's an insecurity that she doesn't actually know if she's worth wanting. And so this other gentleman represents her being wanted in the face of her husband. It doesn't mean
Right.
she actually wants someone else to hit on her. It's exposing her own vulnerability and uncertainty about her desirability.
So if you're the spouse on the listening side, receiving this fantasy, if you're the husband in this story, instead of immediately jumping into what you want, who is it? Who's the guy that you want hitting on you? And
Right?
who, right? That's
What, I'm
rather
not
than
enough
that.
for you that you need someone else? What's
Right,
wrong
right.
with me? Yeah.
No wonder. So next time, is she gonna share fantasy with him? No,
Mhm.
no. We got to remember, fantasies are just that. They're fantasies. Can we keep it the discussion or the understanding, the maturity in that realm? I think it would help both couples, explore their sexuality and make more meaningful connections together.
And there are cases where one spouse shares a fantasy and the other can even acknowledge, like, okay, I see that meaning for you. I see why that's enticing, but I just can't join you in that. That's also fair, right? Like, that just is not a space or a place that I can go with you. And that's okay that that person has that fantasy and that they then work on collaborating in another area. Just because you have a fantasy doesn't mean that that relationship has to enact that or has to become a part of your sexual script. It is just one of the many possibilities.
That's great. Next question from a wife. She says, I have a fantasy that turns me on from a TV show that I watched. Is that okay? She writes, what first really flipped the switch for me in our sex life was coming across a TV show with a storyline that showed a lot of high meaning, very positive meaning in relationships, but also very sexually explicit. I used to have trouble getting in the mood for sex. Now I find that just contemplating that story and those meanings puts me in the mood right away. It's also where my mind goes a lot during sex. I like imagining myself living out the identity and meaning that belongs to the woman in the story, and imagining my husband doing the same as being the man. But is this a form of breaking contact with my partner if my mind is always going there? How can you maintain or increase or avoid losing partner engagement if you find that you need to or really like to engage mentally with a story or fantasy during sex? Just to be clear, I don't think it's an issue of partner replacement. I'm not imagining myself with another person. I'm imagining the woman in the story being with the man in the story. And I just find it really energizing to think about these couples and their dynamics. But I still wonder whether it's an issue of partner disconnection.
I would say this is a perfect example of psychological fantasy and arousal that is very healthy. And we
Yes.
often come across those meanings and contexts in literature, in our culture, in life experiences. And she happened to come across this in a TV show.
Uh huh.
Um, this is one of the rare TV shows where the woman in the show is actually portrayed as a very intelligent, capable woman and also very in touch with her sexuality. And so it does have a lot of rich context and meaning. And I do actually tell a lot of women that I coach to check out stories, to check out storylines and context, because there's sometimes so much richness and depth there to grasp onto
Yes. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that you can bring in to enhance your own sexuality, your own understanding, your own psychological arousal. It's very normal to have an arousing context that is helpful.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And it's not partner disconnection, it's just part of bringing your mind along with your heart and your body.
And I would also say look to the fruit. Like a bad tree can't bring forth good fruit, a good tree can't bring forth bad fruit. Like, what is the result of employing this fantasy in your sexual interaction with your husband? Is it strengthening your overall bond? Is it bringing you closer together? Or
Mhm.
is it inviting disconnection and, what if it's moving you further away from your goals? I think that would be a telltale sign if this is helpful or harmful for your marriage.
Yes. And I actually do know this person who submitted this question, so I
Uh-huh.
happen to know more of the story. And
Yes.
more of the story is that they have struggled so much to
Yes.
find a sexual connection and for
Mhm.
her to find her own sexuality and her own eroticism. And this really helped develop that in her, which is common. It's so common for women to have shunned the psychological development of sexuality and eroticism.
Right.
So
We
this is
categorically think it's all wrong or evil beneath them or something.
Yes, yes, and so this is part of her opening up, part of her development, and I also happen to know that their intimacy has gotten much more meaningful
Mhm.
and, collaborative and rich. So,
Yes. That's great.
definitely not partner displacement or disconnection.
No, and if we're gonna be look at it from this angle, any fantasy about any storyline in one way or another, you're inviting your spouse to kind of be a stand-in or a proxy for it.
Mm.
Like,
Mhm.
even in the most vanilla missionary position, like, type of a way of engaging sexually, there's some sort of a little bit of a proxy going into the sexual encounter, and it's not harmful. It's just the way things go. That's the way we do things.
It's
And
part of bringing some erotic tension. What she's
yes.
doing is she's taking these roles, which were very well portrayed in the show, and very much a masculine and feminine, but in
Mhm.
their healthy senses, and allowing her and her husband to move into this storyline, into this context to create that. And I think it's a very healthy example.
Great. Okay, this next one's spicy. It's about a threesome, and I got a lot of questions about fantasies regarding threesomes or inviting other people into the bedroom. This is what this man said. My wife and I had been married for 19 years and are in our late 30s. We have a great relationship. We love being together and we have very frequent sex. We are pretty high desire and enjoy lots of sex. We are also Christians and very active in our church and sincerely do want to follow Jesus Christ. In the last year, I found out that my wife, throughout our marriage, almost always needs to fantasize to get to orgasm, which is interesting to know. That's fine, I guess. In addition, she also told me she has frequently fantasized about another man having sex with her while she was orgasming. Instead of being angry or upset, it actually excited me. I told her that I'm okay if she tells me when it happens and what she imagines. Fast forward 6 months, and we have been having very hot sessions, and things have been very steamy. We both enjoyed it tremendously, but it has come to the point where we often talk about our fantasies of threesomes or her doing sexual things with other men in the form of foreplay. We have even read some erotica together and along those lines to excite ourselves before sex. Neither one of us want to do anything like that in real life, and I don't think the danger is that we might try it. We believe wholeheartedly that sex is only between us, and we are very satisfied with each other. But we certainly have enjoyed fantasizing about it. At some time, we are starting to wonder if this is healthy for our marriage and if we are really confused as to what this is living against our values. Although we would never do these things outside of our marriage, is it okay to use it in our fantasies? So that's the essence of the question. And we've hit on some of these points already, but let's talk about it, Amy.
Yes,
What do you
I
think?
actually get a lot of questions about threesomes, and people find it very troublesome because they, like this couple, have no desire to actually invite someone from the outside in. They have no desire to be intimate with anyone but their spouse. And so this context of a third person or a threesome in a fantasy can be extremely troubling, and they wonder if they're immoral or if something's wrong with them, and that's very normal. But I also
Yet
want to
it's a
say
compelling fantasy.
it
It's
is it's
sexually
com
exciting, right?
yes.
Yes. How do you
Again,
reconcile that?
you reconcile often the meanings of this. And again, if you look at the meaning of a third person or a threesome, it is inviting in what would be a threat. A
Yes.
third person would threaten a relationship. It would be competition. It would be someone that could take your most dearly beloved away, or all of a sudden you might be compared to them, or you may be less than or more than, or something. There could be jealousy, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
The addition of a third isn't actually usually about bringing a third person in. It's about playing with the tension of the threat is neutralized. There
Uh-huh.
is no jealousy. In fact,
Right.
there's pleasure and arousal. And so, what again you're doing is bringing in that threat and in the context in your mind. And that's what is really important to understand about fantasies. Fantasies are scripts you can play out in your mind, but you don't actually want them in real life. And what they're doing is creating that tension that allows for arousal. And
Mhm.
I often find even that couples that accept this part of themselves more, it actually reduces desire to be sinful in any sexual way outside of marriage. It actually takes that away. Like it has a place to go,
Right.
right?
It's like a neutralizing agent in a way.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah. Like this is that safe
It
place
tames it. Uh-huh.
that can tame it and contain it. And it does take away temptation.
Mhm.
Why? I don't know.
Uh-huh.
You may
Uh-huh.
have to ask God why fantasies were created this way, but it allows us to step into forbidden, but do it in a way where we have choice. It allows us to take things that would be the most threatening and again, they become arousing. And I think what's clear with this couple and what would have to be clear in any type of fantasy like this is that there's actually no desire to enact this,
Actually bring a third
actually
person
enact
in.
it. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
that this is a script that creates the forbiddenness, that creates the tension, that allows both people psychologically to move into a different erotic space. And that's what they're playing in. They're playing in the tension of that imaginative erotic space.
And this discussion reminds me of another third person fantasy that I hear a lot of, and that's the husband wanting to see his wife with another man.
Mhm.
And
Or
they
another
freak out
woman.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or yeah, exactly. Just
Mhm.
that idea of, like, sharing their spouse, like, in the light of day, that would be very difficult. But
Mhm.
when you think about the meanings, I think in marriages, especially when it comes to a sexual relationship between husband and wife, it's so legal, it's so de facto, it's so assumed that well, of course I'm gonna have sex with you. Who else am I gonna have sex with? But in
Mhm.
the fantasy world, the idea that other people find this woman just as compelling, just as attractive, and I don't own her,
I was gonna say, and
that
I don't own them, right?
and
It
I
has
don't
that
own her.
freedom in it, right?
Yes,
Now you're in a free meaning, you're in a choice meaning, like, it's not like I
right,
have to or I should, it's like, "Wow, she's so
right,
compelling that others want her, so do
right.
I."
And also a little further on that is, and she is free to have sex with whoever she wants. She can have sex with other men too. And yet the reality is she still chooses me back.
Mhm. Yeah,
There's there's this it's I think that's why that particular fantasy, or one possible explanation why that particular fantasy is so appealing to a lot of men, husbands, but
right,
also distressing at the same time. Like, why do I
right.
really think this?
It steps into the forbidden and the taboo, which always illustrate choice and freedom, because you actually
Hmm.
have to have freedom to even pretend in taboo, right? And it
Hmm.
also neutralizes the most threatening thing in a relationship, which would be a third person, right?
Right.
The jealousy, the competition. And so it actually opens up freedom in so many ways.
So there's an underlying message behind this question that I think we should address now. And it's this idea as Christians, we do believe in monogamy. We do
Mhm.
believe that that's really important. But would fantasizing about these things be, I don't know, a sin? Be somehow unsavory? Like before God, would we be condemned for even in our fantasies thinking about a third person? I think there's this underlying, like, am I doing something wrong in God's eyes with this? And maybe we're a little, as coaches, we're a little beyond the bounds of our expertise in explaining that, but I think it's worth talking, at least from a coaching perspective, what your thoughts and my thoughts are about employing fantasies that don't necessarily line up with black and white biblical teachings like this. They don't fit neatly into the gospel narrative.
They really don't, and yet they do.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So you aren't actually letting go of your morality. You are using themes and contexts and plots to actually bring you closer to your husband. You're using themes that help you step into your body. And the fruit of this, as you said, is actually looking at what this is creating in your marriage.
Yeah.
And the depth that this safety and vulnerability and collaboration brings is so powerful.
Mhm.
I can't, however, say for every person what kind of fantasy would be considered moral or immoral. There are so
Right.
many nuances in there. I do believe that's an individual decision for you
Mhm.
and for your marriage, and may have to do with your individual experiences and if there's any trauma involved. And I mean, there's
Right.
just like a lot of other factors in there. I think we always want the tell me this is moral, tell me this is
Yeah, give me the
immoral.
black and white.
Give
Uh-huh.
me the black and white, list what's okay, what's not okay. And I
Yep.
feel like you could have missionary sex and it could be so violating and you could do one of these wild fantasies and it could be the exact opposite. And so
Be
I
sanctifying.
it could
Yeah.
be very sanctifying, exactly.
This is my personal belief that God doesn't operate in blacks and whites with every single thing. He leaves a lot up to us to figure out ourselves and to bring to Him for what's right for us. For some things, not for all things, but for many things. Because without it, we wouldn't grow and develop. If everything is handed to us and told, like we have a manual, this is the way to do it and not to do it, and that was it, without any room for variation, without any room for flexibility, we'd be robots. And God doesn't want robots. He wants children that can grow to become more like Him, is my belief. So, uh, what is totally okay for one couple may not be totally okay for a different couple, and they will be held accountable differently because you got to take into account so much variation in proclivities and personality, like what you said. So much family of origin, culture. There's so much variation there. So for this dear couple, That's going to be a question you can struggle with yourself in your own marriage and bring it to God yourselves. But we're not going to sit here and say, here's a list of things that are okay and not okay, beyond the general framework we've already been given. Thank you for listening. This concludes our Q&A episode on sexual fantasies. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you a lot of things to think about and helps you spark the conversation in your own marriage, in your own fantasies with you and your spouse. Now, if you have more questions about fantasies and how they relate to building a healthy sexual relationship in your marriage, you're free to check out our private Facebook group. There's a link to it in the show notes, and you can also get to it from our Facebook page, Get Your Marriage On. In addition, I want to invite you to get some marriage coaching or marriage counseling from myself or Amy and our entire Get Your Marriage On team. We have a fantastic program for married couples and individuals that are really designed to help you move the needle in a positive direction in your marriage. Our coaching is expert, and we really invest heavily into our client success. You'll find out all these details on our website, getyourmarriageon.com/program. I will catch you next week, and have a great weekend.